everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Patriot Backtalk. I'm your host, Kyle Johnson. Today, we're going to tear into a topic that has been extremely popular in the news in the last couple weeks and has been controversial in our nation for decades: abortion. Now, recently, the big news that was quote-unquote leaked from the Supreme Court is that the justices appear to be in agreement that the 1973 decision, known as Roe v. Wade, which protects women who want to terminate their pregnancy from legal backlash, should be overturned. And now this is a major step for people who have been fighting on the pro-life side of the argument, as this action would put the decision to legalize abortion solely in the hands of the individual states. On the flip side, there is outrage among the pro-choice groups of people that believe they deserve the right to end their pregnancy by killing the child. And there's been nationwide protests against repealing the decision, including many people protesting outside the personal houses of conservative Supreme Court justices. And I can't help but think what would be happening if right-wing protesters were doing the same. It would be called rioting, threatening a public servant, etc. But since it's libs and lefties doing it, it fits the media's preset narrative, so it's fine. But I digress. What I want to do first is I want to first take you inside the legalities of the Roe v. Wade decision from 1973 and explain what it actually entails. Then I want to switch to the moral dilemma that abortion causes and some science that backs up a child in the womb being a human being from the moment of conception. So just hang with me. Let's start in 1973, though abortion has actually been argued long before then. We actually had laws against abortion in this country since Connecticut passed a law in 1821 banning abortions in the state. So we've been dealing with this for over 200 years, folks. But the 1970s is when the floodgates really opened. Around this time, a woman named Sarah Waddington recruited fellow lawyer Linda Coffey to assist in efforts to get abortion legalized. And together they began looking for a suitable plaintiff, and they knew they needed someone that the eyes of the nation, but more importantly the courts, would sympathize with. The first woman they tried to build a case on, they said had a neurochemical disorder that meant that she shouldn't be allowed to give birth or raise kids. So just in case a woman like this got pregnant, abortion should be an option for her. And this ultimately seemed far too labeling of the woman, and they didn't see the courts being convinced of their cause this way. They actually took a while to weed through candidates and ended up finding a woman named Norma McCorvey in Texas. Norma was pregnant with her third child and wanted an abortion. But District Attorney Henry Wade, name sound familiar, was in charge of enforcing the anti-abortion legislation there in Texas. When Waddington and Coffey first asked McCorvey if she thought abortion should be legal, McCorvey wasn't sure. However, the two lawyers quickly explained and convinced her that it's just a piece of tissue, and they did eventually get her to agree that abortion should be legal. McCorvey also questioned if she was the right candidate to be represented in a case like this, and she was told, and I quote, by the lawyers, "Yes, you're white, you're young, pregnant, and you want an abortion." That seems a little racist and divisive if you ask me, but more on that later. Regardless, McCorvey agreed and they began working on the case, with McCorvey's name being changed for privacy to Jane Roe. Their goal was to have two separate cases that they would present to multiple different judges, and then if they found one that they felt would take their side in the case, they'd combine these two cases and present all arguments together. They found a panel of judges in the U.S. Court of Appeals in the 5th District that voted in 1970 in favor of McCorvey, and ruled that the Texas law violated the Constitution, and shortly after, this decision reached the Supreme Court. Now, a lot happened from the original oral arguments in 1971 before the final ruling. Two of the justices actually retired in between the first hearing, and the two new justices were appointed halfway through the process. As arguments continued over the next year, Chief Justice at the time, Warren Burger, assigned Justice Harry Blackmun to write the opinion on the Roe v. Wade case. And he was actually hand-selected because he was the most liberal judge and had the best chance of the people not revolting against him, so they thought. Shortly after the opinion was written, the judges had deliberated, and on January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled 7-2 in favor of Jane Roe on the grounds that the Texas law was unconstitutional. And in doing so, They first stripped the states of the rights to make their own laws about abortion without the federal government getting in the way. And second, but most importantly, they condemned over 63 million babies to death in the years from 1973 till now in 2022. And I want to mention that from the time that the lawyers got McCorvey to sign the papers and agree to be the plaintiff, they never spoke a word to her until 4 months after the final decision. They didn't care about her quote-unquote rights. They used her to win a case and nothing else. And I also want to go into this idea that these 63 million abortions represent exactly 63 million human beings' lives lost. It's a baby. Science itself proves that life begins at conception. The exact second that the egg is fertilized, those cells separate and form a brand new DNA chain, completely separate of the father or the mother. It's not the mother's body, folks. That chain of cells that begins growing right away is a separate human. Its own separate heart begins beating 22 days after conception. It forms its own organs, circulatory system, respiratory system, arms, legs, nose, mouth, ears, lips, eyes, fingers, toes. It is a completely separate human being. And from that moment on, it has everything that a human being has. The only thing that's added from that moment on is the nutrition to help the baby grow. And also, the argument about the baby couldn't survive outside the womb, of course it couldn't. God designed the womb to be the safe, secure place for the developmental process to happen. It's a human being's life starting, and it needs to be protected. I mean, for crying out loud, our federal government has determined that you cannot disturb or remove a native bird nest that has eggs in it, under penalty of law. We're protecting the lives of birds as an embryo on a federal level, but not human beings, whose lives are infinitely more valuable. So let's fast forward to 2022. Someone leaked an opinion drafted by Associate Justice Samuel Alito. And this isn't like leaking the details of a Marvel movie prior to its release, by the way. This is a major federal prosecution level stuff. And we'll see in the coming weeks if they can narrow down who actually released this information and why. Personally, I think it was released intentionally to cause division and chaos in our country before the final ruling, and also before the midterm elections. We saw intentional chaos before the 2020 election with COVID that was utilized to allow such things as drop boxes and mass mail-in ballots. But COVID really isn't scaring people like it used to, and they needed a fresh uprising. But in this draft from the Supreme Court, it details why Roe v. Wade wasn't constitutional. And folks, it wasn't. And this has been a major legal argument against abortion for years. It's not mentioned in the Constitution. And therefore, it's supposed to be up to the individual states to decide and rule on. And that's basically what this ruling would do if it's passed in the next couple of months. And as of right now, it looks like it will. I've also heard an argument a couple of times about how this ruling could override almost 50 years of precedent. And my response to that is this. Is precedent really all we need to look at to determine ethical issues? Because we had a civil war in this country where the Union Army fought against the Confederate Army, and folks, the Union Army was the one fighting against precedent. Slavery was widely accepted in this country, and precedent said it was fine. In fact, the South technically had their quote-unquote rights trampled by the North. But none of us look back and think, boy, the Union sure should have let that precedent of slavery stand. No, we look back at the bravery of Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army for standing against the evil even when it wasn't always popular at the time. And there's also a difference between these precedents versus set-in-stone constitutional rights. The right to bear arms or the right to freely worship, these are set, unshakable rights that we have the constitutional responsibility to defend. It's also worth mentioning, too, that after the Roe v. Wade decision, multiple people involved closely with the trial went on to at least question, if not fully regret, their involvement. Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe herself, later stated she was not made aware of how far spread abortion was to be legal after her lawsuit, or how devastating it would be to the women involved. And in 2002, she filed a lawsuit in the 5th District of Texas to have Roe v. Wade overturned based on the emotional turmoil it caused, and she was denied. Think about that. The Roe in Roe v. Wade wanted to ban abortions again and was told no. And it just shows they don't care about women or women's rights. If they did, they would defend the rights of women in the womb as well. Abortion is divisive, manipulative, and leaves a trail of emotional scarring behind with the parents and takes the chance of life away from a human being that deserved a place in this world. And as the line from the Declaration of Independence says, we have the rights as Americans of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those rights of life and liberty are extended to every citizen of the United States, from the tiniest in the womb to the oldest amongst us. And that is something worth fighting for. Now, I'm going to wrap this episode up. I realize that this is a polarizing subject, and as always, I welcome messages on Facebook or Truth Social now, or you can send an email to patriotbacktalk@gmail.com. And remember, never back down or be ashamed of your patriotism. God bless you all and stay crazy. We'll talk soon.